Anybody who's been tuning into mainstream media recently with an interest in real estate couldn't help but be aware that there have been a number of highly negative forecasts about what's likely to happen, so they say, to Australian property prices over the next 1 to 2 years. What I would urge people to do who are concerned about the likelihood, allegedly, that property prices are going to fall 15, 20, 25% in the next 12 months, to keep in mind the track record of the people making these forecasts. As I will show you, it's not terribly good, and perhaps their forecasts don't deserve the credibility that media generally is giving them. And so I would pose the question, when considering the likely future outcome of property prices around Australia, who should we believe? Now, just in the last couple of weeks, ANZ Bank has published its latest forecast for the future of property prices this year and next year, and it's fairly negative prediction. It's expecting property prices overall to fall 8% across Australia this year and another 9% next year, but it's expecting bigger falls in Sydney and Melbourne. Next year it's expecting quite big falls in Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide on top of the falls this year. At the same time, Westpac has also published its latest forecast for property prices, and it's predicting that in the next 12 months we're going to see an 18% decline in house prices in the two biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. Now, Commonwealth Bank has also published its latest forecast. Gareth Ed, the head of Australian economics, has said that they expect house prices across Australia to fall about 15% between now and the middle of next year. So in considering whether we should be giving these forecasts any credibility and whether we should be particularly concerned about the future of property prices in Australia, let's consider the recent track record of some of these individuals and organisations in predicting the outcome of the Australian property market. Back in March, April 2020, a lot of people published forecasts because we had recently seen the arrival in Australia of COVID-19 and apparently dramatic impact it was going to have on the Australian economy and therefore on property markets. We started to see some fairly dire negative forecasts about the future of property prices being made by the usual suspects, as they call them, around about March, April 2020. ANZ Bank, Felicity Emmett and Adelaide Timbrell, who recently had their forecasts for this year published, back then, a couple of years ago, they forecast that Australian capital city prices were going to fall by up to 13% in 2020 in the wake of the arrival of the pandemic in Australia. Shane Oliver, AMP Capital chief economist, often in the media with his forecasts, what's going to happen, he says, with property prices. He was predicting that property prices would fall 20% in 2020 in the wake of the pandemic's arrival. Louis Christopher from SQM Research, he thought it was possible that prices in Sydney and Melbourne could fall as much as 30% from the peak. Gareth Ed, Commonwealth Bank, head of economics, his forecast, he published a range of scenarios. His best case scenario was that property prices in Australia would fall 11% in 2020, and that the worst case scenario was a fall of 32%. Can you imagine that? A third of the value of our homes being wiped off. That was the prediction from the Commonwealth Bank, our biggest home lender. National Australia Bank was a little bit more moderate, but nevertheless its forecast was extremely negative. City prices to fall 10 to 15% in the next 12 months, and their forecast made in April 2020 was that by the end of 2021 property prices would have fallen 30% across Australia. Bill Evans from Westpac, he was expecting prices to drop 10% in the next 12 months. UBS, which is a bank that often makes very negative forecasts for the residential property market in Australia, their prediction, a fall of 20% in the next 12 months. Martin North, probably the most stridently negative critic of housing market in Australia from Digital Finance Analytics, his forecast was that there was a 60% chance that house prices would fall by 30% to 45% in 2020 due to high unemployment. Can you imagine almost half the value of house prices wiped out in 1 year alone, according to that forecast, in the wake of the arrival of COVID-19 in Australia. So let's compare those rather dire and very negative forecasts for property prices in Australia in 2020 with the actual outcomes. What actually happened, according to CoreLogic and Domain, the figures that they published in January 2021, was that nationally prices actually rose 6%. Sydney was up 7%, Canberra 9%, Hobart, Darwin, regional Tasmania, they all rose 12%. So we had some locations in Australia with double-digit increases in their property prices in a year in which all those major, supposedly credible commentators and economists had predicted that we're going to have declines in property prices anywhere between 10 and 30%, and in the most extreme scenario, 45%. Some people got it right. The people who, particularly the people who specialise in real estate analysis, such as Simon Presley, Propertyology, he correctly forecast that we were going to move into a national property boom in 2020. So did James Simon from Aussie, and yours truly. We also, at Hotspotting, predicted that Australia was going to move into an upcycle, not a period of price decline, and we certainly got that right. So fast forward to the beginning of 2021, and the usual suspects were back again with their forecasts for what was going to happen for property prices in the year. And most of them had got the message by now that prices were actually rising, not falling. So they made their forecast for 2021. The ANZ, Felicity Emmett, Adelaide Timbrell together forecast that house prices on average would rise about 9%, although a little bit less in Melbourne and Sydney in 2021. Alan Oster of National Australia Bank, their chief economist, he predicted house prices in the capital cities would rise just 5% in 2021, but Melbourne and Sydney would be less than that, 3.6% in Melbourne, 4.4% in Sydney, according to his prediction. Gareth Ed, head of economics at Commonwealth Bank, his forecast was for house prices to rise 8%, unit prices just 5% in 2021. Shane Oliver, chief economist, AMP Capital, he was back again with a forecast that house prices in Australia would rise 5% in 2021. Bill Evans from Westpac said just 4%. Roy Christopher from Eskom Research, he had a range of scenarios ranging from 5% increase in property prices to a 9% increase in 2021. Tim Lawless from CoreLogic, often in the media, his forecast that prices would rise somewhere between 7 and 10%, although less in Sydney and Melbourne. And UBS again, their forecast was prices to rise somewhere between 5 and 10% in 2021. So what actually happened in the light of all those forecasts with most people, the usual suspects forecasting rises of 5, 7, maybe 10% in property prices in 2021. Nationally, they actually rose 25%. Sydney was up 30%, so was Brisbane. Hobart, Canberra, Adelaide up 26, 27%, and many of the regional markets had fantastic growth as well. Regional Queensland, 26% rise. Regional Tasmania, 29%, and regional New South Wales, 31%. Now, none of those forecasters, none of the senior economists for our major banks, or Shane Oliver, AMP Capital, and all the other usual suspects, none of them saw the property boom coming. They were predicting increases of 5, 6, 7%, and what we got was one of the biggest property booms in the history of Australia. So I would have to ask, how good are they at what they do? How good are their property forecasting skills? Not very, I would suggest. So keep that in mind next time you see yet another headline in mainstream media saying property prices are going to crash, they're going to drop 15% in the next 12 months, or 20% or 25% in some of the more extreme cases. And enormous credibility is being given by journalists to the forecast made by the usual suspects, notwithstanding their pretty terrible track record as evidenced by the outcomes compared to their forecasts over the past 2 or 3 years. Keep it in mind, and I would suggest you disregard their forecasts because they never get it right.